Hello, this is your 1-minute warning. You're not allowed to leave after 1 minute. You have to stay. Okay, folks, the boss is here. I'm going to get started. Thank you for staying behind this morning for this redevelopment project update. And before I start, I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from my church located in the city of Victoria on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen people, known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. Their historical stewardship of this beautiful land continues today, and I am proud that First Met is committed to joining them in this stewardship. Next slide, please. Oh, we're already there. We have many people working on our redevelopment project, and I would like to acknowledge them before I start my presentation. Don Evans, the region's Director of Property Development, and his team of staff and consultants are managing First Met's project, as well as many others underway in the region. We are grateful for their support. Our team here at First Met, known as the RTG, acts as a liaison with the region's team, providing input from First Met and facilitating the First Met decision-making process. And of course, there is our First Met board, which stays close to the project, receiving monthly updates from the RTG. Next slide. My objectives for the day's presentation is to provide you, the congregation, with an update on our redevelopment project and where it's heading. My last formal redevelopment update was presented in July of last year in a Zoom meeting attended by the First Met men's group and other interested congregants. The focus today is going to be on what has happened on this project since July 21st, 2021. However, I am including as a refresher on the history of the project to provide context for the uninitiated. There's a handout, or two handouts that have been provided, one with a more detailed history of the redevelopment project, and as well as a copy of the slides that you're going to see today's presentation. Additional copies are going to be available in the office or by emailing me, and I will provide my contact information at the end. I'll take questions after the presentation, and will happily speak to people offline later if they like. Next slide, please. I appreciate that my project updates can be a little like looking at alphabet soup, and perhaps just as boring because of all the acronyms I use. I use them to save room on the PowerPoint slides and sometimes to speed up the delivery of the presentation. But that's not helpful if the acronyms confuse you. So I'd like to go through some that you're going to see and hear today. CEW stands for the Christian Education Wing. DMR stands for the Doreen McLeod Room, just out behind. FH stands for Fellowship Hall. HBA stands for the Heritage Building and Annex. And that includes the sanctuary, the DMR and chapel, everything above it and everything below it in this big brick building. PMR stands for Pacific Mountain Region and its Property Resource Team, also referred to in my presentation this afternoon as the region. RTG, that's the First Met Redevelopment Task Group. SS, the Social Suite Building. UCC, United Church of Canada. If you don't know that, you probably shouldn't be here. And UPRC, which is a new acronym. United Property Resource Corporation. And I'm going to explain a little bit about that later in the presentation. Next slide, please. My update on First Met's redevelopment project is two parts, a brief project refresher and the current project status. And the current project status is what I really want to focus on. Next slide, please. The refresher that I'm going to give you now is in chronological order, just to make it easy. Next slide. 2018. In April of 2018, First Met gave some thumbs up to PMR's redevelopment proposal. Those of you who were here in 2018 may remember the many meetings in the spring that were held to review and approve the region's proposal for redeveloping First Met property. That proposal was to build an apartment building with 50% affordable units on the site of the social suite and the fellowship hall. First Met's equity contribution to the project was to be the land currently occupied by those two buildings, as well as the proceeds from the sale of First Met's interest in Balmoral Garden Court property on North Park Street, for a combined total of $2.8 million. And there's more detail on that in the handout that I gave you on the background. In return, First Met was to receive $10 million of building restorations and renovations to the Heritage Building and the Christian Education Wing. That $10 million included $3 million up front in restoration work to be included as part of the building construction, and $7 million of restoration and renovations to be done after construction and funded by First Met's share of the operating revenue from the apartment building, spread out over a period of 15 to 20 years. An agreement was signed with the region in May, and work on the project started in the fall of 2018. Next slide, please. 2019. Near the end of 2018, the RTG had gathered information on First Met's space needs and handed that information over to the region in January of 2019. Some of you will remember the meetings we had to talk about that with the congregation. Also in the fall of 2018, the region had applied for a loan from BC Housing for pre-development planning. And early in 2019, they received a loan of $250,000 from BC Housing. That loan was for various space and condition assessment reports related to the Heritage Building. The region's architects in the spring and the summer assessed First Met's space needs, confirming that there was enough space in the Heritage Building to meet our needs for the foreseeable future, and recommending that the Christian Education Wing be demolished and the site included in the footprint of the proposed apartment building. More housing on the site. Work on the project continued through the fall while the region waited for BC Housing to approve a second loan for additional pre-development work. But unfortunately, in the fall, the region was notified by BC Housing that there was a $3 million equity gap in the region's financial plan for the project. Next slide, please. Through the first quarter of 2020, the region and BC Housing tried to resolve the equity gap issue without success, and the First Met project was halted. The region turned its attention to looking at options to restructure the financing of First Met's project, including the use of conventional lenders, private investors, and also obtaining United Church of Canada assistance. In the late fall of 2020, the region and the RTG agreed to request the UPRC, the United Property Resource Corporation, to review the feasibility of the First Met project. The UPRC is a wholly owned subsidiary of the United Church of Canada, with a mandate to help faith groups across Canada plan and implement property development projects. They are aligned with the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation and have funding from CMHC to help congregations do this. Next slide, please. For the first half of 2021, the UPRC focused on reviewing the feasibility of building affordable housing on the Balmoral Road site. We've been down that road in 2018, and we're going down that road again in the first half of 2021. The UPRC made contact with the City Planning Department to discuss different designs, and they concluded that a 10-story design, which will require formal rezoning approval from the city, could work. The UPRC also concluded that any restoration and renovation work on the heritage building that needs to be done before or during construction of the apartment building cannot be funded from the budget of the apartment building project. This means that the project team will need to find another source of funding for this type of restoration work. The UPRC agreed to take a closer look at how to fund the heritage building restorations and renovations, that component of the project, and explore the possibility of obtaining government grants for some of this work. Next slide, please. That takes us to 2022 and the next step, the current status. Next slide, please. In March of this year, the UPRC reported back that the federal government capital grants for heritage building restoration and renovation might be available if First Met were to create a community and cultural events center on the site. However, they concluded that the city would not support the expansion of the heritage building or allow a connection between the heritage building and the new residential building to create such an event center. They also concluded that it is not possible to have both an apartment building and a community and cultural event center built on the site. The site is just too small to support it. Next slide, please. The UPRC also took a look at some interior space renovations that could be done in the heritage building to help improve its functionality and rentability. They suggested that we could lightly renovate the sanctuary, particularly with the technology, audiovisual, sanctuary lighting, staging, painting, and the potential removal of additional pews, or the remaining pews. They also suggested renovating the DMR and chapel into a multi-purpose gathering space with about a capacity for about 150 people, and that we could renovate the lower level into co-working space, congregation offices, meeting rooms, community kitchens, a community kitchen, and storage. You will note in the project background handout that similar renovations were recommended by the region's architects in 2019. Next slide, please. There are several things of note about the assessment that UPRC did. The assessment is silent on, or does not comment on, the renovations or restoration that would be needed to make the heritage building a fully functional, accessible, and self-contained building on the site after demolition of the Christian Education Wing, Social Suite, and Fellowship Hall. The UPR's assessment of the heritage building is also silent on the restoration needs of the building systems in the heritage building that were identified in the 2019 Building Condition Assessment Report. That report identifies approximately 2 million of restorations, possibly more, that would be required over time, including 1 million or more for seismic upgrades. There is a possibility that these seismic upgrades to the heritage building would be required before the start of or during construction of the apartment building. Next slide, please. The UPRC also commented on where funding for the restoration and renovation of the heritage building could come from, including the annual surplus revenues from the operating the apartment building, which are estimated by UPRC to be $275,000 or more per year, depending on which CMHC financing program is used for the project. I point out that this estimate is sensitive to changes in interest rates and construction cost assumptions, so it is not a commitment, it's just an estimate. First Met fundraising may be required for restorations and renovations which must be done before or during construction of the apartment building. And another source of funding for renovation and restoration may be government grants for tenant improvements requested by eligible arts and cultural organizations which have a long-term space lease with First Met. Now, currently, we don't have any arts and cultural organizations with a long-term lease, but if we were able to find an arts and cultural organization that wanted to lease our space on a longer-term basis, then they would be, if they were eligible, they would be able to apply for government grants to help them with tenant improvements, and we would benefit from that kind of thing as well. Unfortunately, First Met is not an arts and cultural organization, cannot apply for these grants. Next slide, please. The UPRC is recommending that our project be split into two separate streams. They're recommending to move forward with the apartment building project. They commented that splitting the project into two streams would allow the apartment building to advance more quickly, while detailed planning for the heritage building restorations and renovations is completed. The benefit of this approach is that it could reduce time delays and therefore the risk of interest rates and construction costs increasing. On the other hand, and these are my comments, not UPRC's comments, on the other hand, delaying a thorough analysis and plan for the needed heritage building restorations and renovations could mean the financial viability of this project for First Met would not be fully understood before seeking municipal approval for the apartment building. This might be risky for First Met and therefore requires further discussion and clarification from the UPRC. So now I want to look at the conclusions and next steps for the project. But before I discuss those next steps, I'd like to draw some conclusions or share some conclusions. Firstly, we are still missing important details about how the preliminary proposal from UPRC would actually impact First Met in terms of costs, risks, and benefits. For example, and these are just a couple of examples, what happens if the city rejects a 10-story building? How can we pay for renovations and restorations that are required before revenue sharing from the apartment building kicks in? And what assurances do we have that First Met will recover its land investment in the project? And there are many others. So that is something that needs to be clarified. The original 2018 vision for the project may not be achievable. In particular, the original funding concept for the project will not work. And if we decide to proceed with redevelopment, then our agreement with the region will need to be restructured and renegotiated. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So there are some next steps. There's three key steps that we will need to take in the days and months ahead. The first step is to obtain more details from UPRC about their proposal, such as what upfront and ongoing project costs will First Met incur, what project risks will First Met have to assume once we start the project, what project responsibility will First Met have, and how will the project be governed by the project partners, First Met, the region, and UPRC. The second step will be for the RTG and the region to evaluate the UPRC proposal, and then for the RTG to recommend to the board and congregation on whether to proceed with the proposal or explore other redevelopment options. Next slide, please. The third step will involve having the congregation address some important questions about First Met's future, including revisiting the importance of the heritage building to the future of our congregation and the need to remain at our current location. Examining the ways and means we have for addressing our financial needs as we move forward. Two examples are exploring amalgamation with other congregations, creating a social enterprise to help fund church operations and programs, and there are other options too, but we need to have that conversation with the congregation. And we also need to finally review and adjust our strategic plans to reflect the decisions that are made during that process. And your board is preparing for these discussions in the coming months. Thank you. Next slide. Yeah, we're up to the question and answers. So, that's where we are. It's not as bright a presentation than the one I made in 2018 when we were presenting the region's proposal to the congregation. The project has slipped sideways, and we need to reset the project if we're going to carry on. So Lyndon has a microphone if you have any desire to make a comment or a question. There's one from Leanne.
I actually don't have a question. I just want to point out to everyone here that Ross has been the chair of the Redevelopment Task Group since 2010, which is 12 years. So I think a round of applause for him and his team is warranted.
Well, I have a question for you. Is there anything that you didn't understand in that presentation about our current situation?
I'm just wondering if you could
Yes,
revisit Next Steps 1 and Next Steps 2 again.
For sure.
In more detail, just to sort of let that soak over us for a moment.
Yes, okay, that's fair. We go back to 1. So as you would have gathered from my comments before we got to Next Steps, we have some uncertainty about exactly what the UPRC is proposing for the church, and some concerns that not all of the implications have been discussed or presented. So we have requested the UPRC to provide additional information, answer some of those questions, and a formal proposal. Up to now with UPRC, we have been working in blocks. First, the apartment building, did they think it was feasible? Then they took a look at the heritage building. Did they think it was feasible to fund renovations and restorations? And the answer was maybe not. And now we need it all put together into a comprehensive proposal that we can look at and assess in its totality. And then once we have that proposal, the region and the RTG will sit down and evaluate it. And whether we make, the RTG will decide what to take to the board, what recommendation to take to the board with respect to proceeding with the UPRC, and hopefully the region will support us in that. That's the process that we have to go through. We have to get through that. And then, when we're, as a congregation, making that decision, I think there are many things that we have to think about. There's nothing certain in a redevelopment project at this phase. We're still at step 1. We got so far down the road in 2019, and then the project got stalled and then halted. And now we basically had to hit reset and go back to step 1 with a different development partner. Colliers was a development partner for the first kick at the cat, and now it's UPRC, and we have to give them a chance to give us their best proposal that we can evaluate. And so that's what we will do. We'll decide whether or not to proceed with the UPRC proposal, and we will be fully transparent about it with the congregation and engage the congregation in a conversation. And part of that may involve looking at or offering up other redevelopment options for the site or other options for what we do going forward. That would be part of that discussion. The next one, 2. This doesn't have to be 1, 2, 3. It could be 3, 1, 2, or it could be 1, 3, 2. It can be in any order. But this third one is probably the most important step, and that is we have to take a look at our long-term commitment to the heritage building. And we have to ask ourselves the question, must the heritage building be part of the legacy for First Met congregation that we build in the future? The idea is, do we need to stay here to be First Met, or could we go somewhere else and be First Met? Because the heritage building and this site is a millstone, financially is a millstone around our neck. We are in the right part of the city to be a church. We couldn't be in a better place to be a church. But it is onerous to be a church like us in this place because of the building and the cost to operate it and support it. And so we have to have that discussion. I don't know what the outcome would be. I know there are varied opinions about that. I know that many people love this space and would never want to leave it, and others just want to get on with the work of being First Met in the community. And where is the best place to do that? And what is the best way to do that? So that's part of the discussion. I know that we did this back in 2018. We had those conversations before we went down the path we did with the region. And the decision was we should stay where we are. I don't know if that would be the decision again.
There have been some changes to the overall cost of operating this building since then that congregation members might need to be made aware of.
Well, yes, and you will learn more about that in the upcoming budget presentation. That'll be part of the picture, yes.
Fully aware of the implications of the current cost of operating things that are deteriorating and breaking down, things that need maintenance, because that has changed since 2018.
Well, yes, our givings have gone down quite a bit since 2018. Our costs are going up since 2018. We've lost ICA as a tenant, so our letting income is at least temporarily going to be lower until we find new tenants to replace them in the space.
Boilers, things like that, you know.
Yes, those will all be discussed. That's under the second bullet there. How do we survive as a congregation in the face of declining membership and revenues? That's the conversation that the congregation needs to have. But you can't have that conversation until we present the budget to you, and that'll happen in May, I think. Is that right, Leanne? Somewhere there. We're hoping. But it's soon. It's on the horizon. And then when you look at that, you've got to think about, well, okay, we've got this financial challenge. How do we deal with it? Can we deal with it by amalgamating with another congregation, inviting another congregation to be here in this location with us? And would that help? Or is there something we can do about creating, like many churches in Victoria have done, creating a social enterprise that generates income for the church, sufficient income to allow us to sustain ourselves here? So those are conversations. I don't know where they're going. I don't want to be presumptuous about it. I have my own opinions, but they're my opinions, not the opinions of the RTG, not the opinions of the congregation yet. And then once we've got all of that figured out, then we need to reflect that in our strategic plan going forward. We figure out our real next steps, I guess the next steps of the church. Not the next steps of the redevelopment project, but the next steps of the church, because this is really an important discussion about our survival in downtown Victoria. Any other questions?
I could probably speak loud enough. Ross, does the RTG have a sense of the
Yes, you can.
overall value of the property? Should the thought of moving come up. I think we know the value of the end property. Do we know the overall value of the whole property?
No, and this is a very difficult property to put a value on because it's got a heritage building on it, which can be an obstacle for developers because there's certain limits on how big a building you can build, and then there's all the other buildings on the site. What do you do with those? So I would say take a look at the assessed value of the church. You can find that. I don't have it with me right now, but the assessed value of the church on the BC assessment website. Just put in the property address. Or maybe Leanne knows.
Can I just ask that you use the microphone even if you think it can be heard in the sanctuary?
Okay, because we're broadcasting, yes.
All right, so the current assessed, or the latest assessed value of the building was, of the entire property, was $4.5 million.
There we go. And now that assessed value, of course, is affected by the fact that there's a heritage building on the site, and so we don't know what the market value would be. In the material that we saw from the United Property Resource Corporation on their proposal to build an affordable housing, valued the property that we would be contributing, that would be the Fellowship Hall, the Christian Education Wing, and the Social Suite building, at $6 million. That goes into their financial model for the project. And so it may be reasonable to expect that over the 15 to 20 year periods of sharing revenue from the operation of the apartment building, that we would be able to recover that $6 million. And those are discussions that we need to have with the UPRC. What level of commitment is the region and UPRC prepared to make to First Met with respect to that particular valuation? And these are all very preliminary things. They can all change as soon as UPRC goes to the city and starts making formal application, as soon as they talk to CMHC about funding. Those things can all change, as they did in the past. Any other?
I'd like to make a comment because I'm part of the RTG, but also partly because I want to reinforce the comments Kyla made, partly because I like them, but also partly because she didn't use the mic. And that is step 2 is something I want you to focus on, particularly the second bullet. As a member of the task group, I'm heavily involved recently, well aware of the survival question. So this is a big deal. And I don't want people to be overly seduced by romantic notions. I'd like them to know the reality.
So today was really primarily meant to bring people up to speed where the RTG is and what we're going to be doing in the next few months. Not to comment on what decision we should make down the road. This has got to be a congregational decision. It's not something that the RTG can make on its own. And the RTG normally would take the recommendation to the board would agree or disagree, or if the board agrees, and we then take it to the congregation and then to the trustees, as we did back in 2018. But it's going to be vital that we have those congregational conversations.
Ross, if we're near the end of it, I'd like to just check with Joan to see if there are any questions that she's received from the streaming service.
Okay. No questions from online?
No.
If you go to the last slide on the deck, I think my contact information is there. I know it takes a lot of time for this stuff to sink in. I've had 11 years on the redevelopment task force, and it's still sinking in.
I'd just like to say a little bit here, because I'm just a more recent person here, and just remind us of this tremendous good enough. Because I know from being a witness that when this project was originally unveiled, it was part of a tripartite system that was made newsworthy of ourselves here and Brecon and one other. Was it in Richmond?
Como Lake,
Como Lake.
Richmond, and there's another one in Vancouver.
I just thought you might wonder, how are they doing? We are clearly stalled and have some important hard questions to ask ourselves. But Brecon is not in their building yet either. It isn't as if somehow we have been the one church to experience roadblocks. The day of hopeful dreaming that redeveloping property would be the answer for so many congregations, that on that day the sun has set. And so many congregations, not just United Church, but of all our sister and brother denominations, are having to ask themselves the same questions, And these are hard questions. It's a very Lenten theme. But I wanted to just add my word to what Leanne said. Because I sometimes sit on this committee meetings, I want to tell you how many hundreds of hours these people have put in to this. And it's not the kind of encouraging work that is self-rewarding. It's hard work. It's hard to get discouraging news over and over again. It's hard to hear the regional church saying, yeah, well, that's not the case anymore. And we are so blessed to have this team in place that continually try to find the best solution for us and are willing to ask hard questions. And that's not a glib statement from me. And so I just wanted to reiterate what Leanne started our meeting with. And do you remember our ministry of encouragement? Send these guys a note to say thank you, because it really is an extraordinary witness to their commitment to this congregation. And I just wanted to interrupt whatever you were going to say and to say that, because I know I speak for all of us. Thank you.
That's quite all right. If there are no more questions, then I'll conclude and ask you to stay tuned. If you think of something after today, my phone number is there, my Gmail address is there. I'll answer the phone and I'll respond to your email as best I can. So thank you.